To replace the upper control arm on a Toyota Hiace, we're going to start off by taking a measurement between the bump stop and the upper control arm. We'll use this measurement a little bit later. Loosen off your wheel nuts and then you can jack the van up into the air just far enough to free the wheel from the ground. Remove the wheel and put an axle stand under. Then come under the back and find the torsion bar. We're going to start off by cleaning off the threads here. And you'll find these two 22mm nuts here. So grabbing a 22mm spanner or two of them, I've got a through hole ratchet here, so I'm going to use one spanner and one through hole ratchet. Now for this particular job you need about 3 hands, so as you can see here I've got a block of wood and I'm resting it up against the chassis, just being very careful not to pinch any of the hoses that are there. So with the block of wood supporting the upper spanner, we're going to loosen off the lower nut. Before we loosen off the upper nut, we're just going to take a measurement of how much thread is showing. This means that we'll be able to return the torsion bar back to the same amount of preload that it had prior to us removing the nuts. Doesn't need to come off all the way, just far enough so that it's loose. Now we can come back around to the front and tackle the rest of the job. So we're going to start off with these 5 bolts here. And we're going to start off with a 17mm socket and just finish off removing that torsion bar. So that's the 2 bolts up the back here. You can see that one is longer than the other. The longer of the 2 goes closer to the engine and the shorter goes closer to the outside of the van, if that makes sense. Next up, we're going to remove the cotter pin from the upper ball joint, and then using, I believe I had a 22mm spanner here, we can remove the castle nut from the ball joint. Separate that upper ball joint from the hub carrier assembly. You can see that there's not much room to work on these 2 bolts that are holding the control arm on. Now, if you're lucky, you'll be able to use a 19mm spanner and then chuck another spanner onto the open end of it to get the leverage that you need. However, if you're like me on this side here, the way that the bolt sits, I just can't get the leverage before I hit the wheel arch. Now, if you had a ratcheting 19mm spanner, you'd be able to move that around to get it into the right spot. Now, you can see on the driver's side, that's how I've actually managed to do it. And as you can see here with the second bolt, it's also in a position where I can't take it off without fouling on the wheel well. So what I have done is taken a 19mm ring spanner, chopped it off a bit short, and then taken a 1/2" drive socket and welded that onto the end of it. Couple that with an extension or 2 and a breaker bar, and I'm in business. So as you can see here, those bolts are on pretty tight. They will take a little bit of force to take off. But once you get that first crack of the bolt, they come loose pretty easily after that. You will need to put some Loctite on before you put them back on. Now I'm just removing this rubber dust shield here so that I can remove the bolts all the way. And getting that second one off there, as you can see. Once both those bolts are out, that control arm should be able to slide off. As you can see, the rubber there has worn away, and on the new one it looks much better. The upper ball joint on the old one is obviously toast as well. The new one, so much firmer. We just need to take a 27mm spanner and loosen off these nylock nuts that are applying force to the bushes. Just enough so that it spins freely. We'll do it up in a moment. Slide that control arm back on and you can start putting your bolts back in. Don't forget to put Loctite on. Make sure you do them up nice and tight. Then you can refit your upper ball joint, castle nut and the cotter pin. Placing a jack underneath the lower ball joint, we want to lift up the suspension just far enough so that we can match the gap that we had at the start of the job between the upper bump stop and the control arm. When you've got that gap set up, you can now go ahead and snug those bolts back up. This means that your control arm bushes are going to be sitting in an unstressed state as your van naturally sits on the road. Reattach the torsion bar bracket, and then we can begin to snug the torsion bar back up. Once you reckon you're close, you can take some measurements and then do some little adjustments to get that measurement back to where it was when it started. Now, up to you how close you get. Once you're happy, put the second nut on. Make sure that when you're tightening up that second nut, that the top nut is nice and supported. We can refit this rubber dust guard, remove the axle stand. Good opportunity to check out your brake pads and your rotors. And then if you're happy with those, chuck the wheel back on. Lower the van down, do up your wheel nuts and take it for a little test drive. Now you have replaced a suspension component, so it is a good idea to get a wheel alignment after this.